Hello, good afternoon, dear participants. Welcome. Welcome, and thank you all for waiting, but we wanted to be very sharp with the timing. So welcome to the international webinar on risk and needs assessment in probation. My name is Jana Spero, and I will be your host today with my dear colleague Anna Esquera. You already know her from emails. Anna, can you wave to everyone so they can see you? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for joining our traditional webinar where we talk about the assessment. I saw from the names that many of you attended last year's assessment when we talked about the experience from United Kingdom, Croatia, and Norway. Today we prepared new examples. This time we stay in Europe for two presentations, but we are very lucky to have something completely different, something very far away. We have our dear colleagues from New Zealand joining us. So first we will be hearing about the experiences in Belgium and the Netherlands, and then we will go all the way to New Zealand to see what's happening there. So let me just remind you that assessment is very important for all probation practitioners. I think that all of you who signed up for this assessment know that very well. As we are facing more and more caseload and the workload in the probation offices all around the world, we have to be aware that a good assessment is an amazing opportunity for probation practitioners to know how to devote their very valuable time when working with the offenders. But it's not just important to know for the time schedule, but it's also important to know how to use it, when to use it. And in the big panel of all possible assessment, what is there for us? What is the best for us to use? So let me just say that we are still expecting some participants to join, as we have 137 registered participants covering, believe it or not, but 33 different countries in the world. So I think it's time to start. And let me tell you one more thing. Under the screen of your presenter, you have a special part called Q&A for questions and answers. And in our agenda, after all three presentations, we will have a time devoted for questions and answers. But just to be sure that you don't forget something, you are please free to use it during the presentations of our presenters. So please, whenever you have a question, just use Q&A and write down your questions, and we will be answering that after all three presentations. So thank you very much. And now I wanna give a floor to our first presentation. This is our dear Dr. Cassia. We like to call you Cassia Uzbelo from the Vrije University of Brussels, and she will be talking about implementing evidence-based risk assessment and management strategies in the Flemish probation and parole services. Her presentation is named Opportunities and Challenges. Cassia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to being invited and to being asked to talk about our experiences with developing and implementing a risk assessment and risk management policy in the Flemish probation services. So thank you for this kind invitation. Since not everyone knows where Flanders is, just for clarification, Flanders is the northern part of Belgium, where people speak Dutch. We are a small but complex country with a complex political system, which complicates the implementation of new policies, also within the probation services. So what I will be telling today only relates to Flanders and not to the southern, the French-speaking part of the country. So for several years now, we have had a new Flemish minister in charge of the Flemish policy on justice. And from the start, this agency wanted to implement a more evidence-based framework within the probation services. More specifically, they wanted to improve the risk assessment of people who have committed crimes, and they wanted to improve risk management and make it more evidence-based. Since until then, there was no clear framework for risk assessment nor management within the probation services. So my research team was appointed to develop and implement a risk assessment and risk management policy within Flemish probation services. So as a framework, we then chose the risk need responsivity model, or the R&R model, because to date, this theoretical framework has the most empirical evidence and is also already implemented in many countries in various settings. You probably already know this framework, but just to be on the safe side, I will recap the most important aspects of this model so that it's clear what the guiding principles of this project are. So the R&R model is a theoretical framework that encompasses some 15 principles, and the authors of this model developed these principles on empirical evidence with the goal of adequately lowering the risk of recidivism in individuals who have committed crimes. There are three main principles, as you can see here: the risk, need, and responsivity principles. According to the first principle, it is important to estimate the recidivism risk at the individual level, with the goal of matching the intensity of the intervention to this risk level. Here, the basic principle is the higher the risk level, the more intensive the interventions should be. But also, the lower the risk level, the less intensive the interventions should be. The second principle, the needs principle, states that one should examine on a person-by-person basis what factors increase the risk of recidivism, because the interventions should target these risk factors that are changeable. And the third principle, the responsivity principle, describes that we should increase the success rates of the interventions by choosing evidence-based interventions on the one hand, and by tailoring the interventions to the profile of the person so that we also thoroughly address the issues that might hinder the success of the intervention. So meanwhile, there is already a great deal of evidence indicating that interventions that adequately follow these principles are more successful in recidivism reduction than those interventions that do not or insufficiently do so. So that's why we chose this framework. So much has been written about the R&R principles, and a great deal of research has been conducted on the R&R principles. You would think then that these principles would be relatively easy to implement in practice, but the reality is different, as we have observed in our project. Implementing evidence-based frameworks, tools, and so on is a long and complex process, one in which you run into a lot of obstacles. And that's what I want to talk about today. We are running into a lot of challenges in implementing this project. But I was only given 20 minutes, so I've picked the three most important ones, hoping to also give you tools as you get started with these frameworks. Also, those already working within an R&R framework can hopefully reflect with us on the challenges that we encounter. I summarized these obstacles in three questions, being: what tools should we best use to estimate risk? Which cases should we especially appraise? And last but not least, how can we make risk management fit the outcomes of a risk assessment as good as possible? But first, let's discuss which risk assessment tools to use. So this may seem like a question to which an answer can easily be formulated, but nothing could be further from the truth. First and foremost, more than 200 risk assessment tools have now been developed and are used in different countries within different settings. There is also no such thing as a risk assessment tool that is equally predictive of all forms of recidivism across all settings. Moreover, to our knowledge, there are no evidence-based guidelines that can support the selection process. So therefore, we decided to develop a decision tree so that the professionals who will have to perform the risk assessments within the Flemish probation services will know which tools are best to use. In this decision tree, we made informed choices at three levels: on the level of content, on the level of the evidence base, and on the level of practice. So first, we considered what the purpose of risk assessments is in each case. What risks do we want to assess in a particular case? After all, that can vary from case to case. And this is determined by the person's prior and current criminal behavior, of course. For example, has he exhibited violent behavior or sexually violent behavior? And the answer to that question is already going to strongly determine which instruments can be considered. Here we also take into account the base rates of certain criminal behaviors. For example, the prevalence rates of recidivism in homicide are generally very low, and therefore it is very difficult to estimate this specific risk. And the person is also more likely to relapse into physically violent behavior, but not necessarily in murder. So information about base rates is also important when choosing risk assessment tools. In addition, there is then the question of whether you want to gain insight into basic risk levels or whether you want to gain better insights into dynamic risk, and whether you want, whether you want to gain more insights into the dynamic risk factors that should be the focus of our interventions. This choice too can differ from case to case. And once you have made these choices, you can still conclude that you have several instruments available to, for example, assess the risk of sexual recidivism. Then it is, of course, important that you choose an instrument that has already been shown to adequately assess recidivism risk, and that its reliability and predictive validity within the specific work context, here being the probation services, of course, have been supported. But even if you choose the best instrument, you may encounter very practical issues that may prevent you from actually using that instrument. And the practical matters we looked at per instrument were, is the information needed to use that specific instrument available within the probation services? Does the instrument require repeated assessments? And if so, how often? And hence, does it require too much time investment? And is the instrument available in Dutch? And based on those questions, we developed this decision tree, as you can see here, in which you can see that we have chosen a specific instrument for each type of recidivism. But please note, you cannot simply adopt or copy this tree within your practice, because it is really applied to our current situation. And you must also take into account that this tree must be adjusted over time based on new empirical insights. The next question we asked ourselves was, in which files should we carry out a detailed risk assessment? That is not an obvious question, but it's an important one, given the context in which our probation officers work, a context in which thousands of files are received every year. But in the current setup, we only have about 10 people who are allowed to carry out risk assessments within the probation services. So it's not feasible to analyze all cases thoroughly. So choices have to be made. However, we soon encountered an important obstacle. There are even fewer evidence or practice-based guidelines for these choices. In other words, it became a choice that was mainly determined by policy or pragmatics. For example, it was decided from a policy perspective to initially focus on sexual offenses. But that number is also, as you saw on the previous slide, much too high for our psychologists that will conduct the risk assessment. It was therefore decided that the psychologists would use the static 99R in the different sexual offender cases. And the static 99R is a risk assessment tool that provides you insights into the static risk factors and into the basic risk level of a certain person. And only individuals who committed a sexual offense, of course, and exhibited a moderate to high risk of recidivism would be assessed further. This strategy implies that low-risk profiles are not being analyzed any further. This selection process will be further expanded to include violent crimes in the near future, but we are now examining which choices need to be made in these particular cases. In addition, the mandates were also examined or taken into regard. Our probation services have to follow up on very different mandates, And the mandates were therefore chosen in which probation officers had the possibility to further optimize risk management strategies themselves, and hence in which mandates a risk assessment would be truly of added value. For instance, in the cases where probation officers are asked to give advice to the judge regarding risk management strategies. And this latter issue brings me to the last question, but a very important one nonetheless, being how to align risk management strategies with risk assessment outcomes. Because as many experts say, and as you can also read here in this quote, the purpose of risk assessment is not the assessment itself, but the purpose of risk assessment is risk management. And there is little point in assessing risks if you do nothing to address those risks. But to reduce recidivism in our clients, it is crucial to translate the risk assessment outcomes into adequate risk management strategies. But various studies, as you can see here, also we conducted a study with the same conclusions, and also testimonies from practice reveal that that's not an easy task for many professionals or decision makers. For instance, professionals experience many challenges to adhere to the two main and at least theoretically straightforward principles of the R&R model, as you can see here in the conclusions of this systematic review. Hence, we cannot assume that adherence to the R&R principles will happen naturally within the probation services. And that's why when implementing the R&R principles in practice, it is very important to consider in detail how probation officers can be supported in making that translation and therefore in developing evidence-based risk management strategies. Also important is to acknowledge the different domains of risk management. People often assume, also including our own probation officers, they often assume that risk management equals psychotherapeutic or medical treatment. But risk management encompasses more than that. It encompasses strategies that fall in 4 domains, being supervision and control efforts, such as placement in secure facilities or supervision by probation officers, the monitoring of risk factors, the treatment such as one-on-one or group counseling, and victim safety planning strategies, such as warning potential victims. And we are currently developing guidelines to assist probation officers in translating risk assessment outcomes into risk management strategies, meaning strategies in the 4 domains. Here you can see the main questions per domain that we are trying to answer based on theoretical and empirical insights on the one hand and on best practices on the other hand. And to be honest, that's not an easy task. Take, for instance, the risk principle. According to that principle, high-risk individuals should receive more intensive interventions than lower-risk individuals. But what is more intensive? What does that mean within the context of the probation services? And what does lower intensive means within this particular context? Should we, for instance, specify the hours of supervision per risk category, or is that not a good idea? So we are currently in close consultation with a focus group on how to answer these and many other similar questions. So I could talk about our implementation project for hours, but I will have to wrap it up. But before I do that, I want to give some final take-home messages for those who are implementing or want to implement the R&R framework within their probation services. First of all, use theoretical frameworks on implementation and on the study of the implementation processes. We used this framework, amongst others. We don't have the time to go into much detail, but it's important to consider the factors that may facilitate and prohibit the implementation process. Factors that lie on the different levels, for instance, on the level of the probation officers, on the level of decision makers, directors, and so on. But also factors that lie within the probation services, but also outside the services. Models like these can help you out identifying these factors. Second, top-down approaches often do not work, at least not in Flanders. Hence, it is important to involve practice from the start, so you can develop evidence and practice-based frameworks and guidelines. Third, have high ambitions, but do it step by step and start with small-scale implementation projects that you supervise closely. This will give you valuable and indispensable insights into the possibilities and obstacles, and it will also give you the opportunity to obtain first-hand experiences of the probation officers. Fourth, very important one is invest in communication with, amongst others, probation officers, coordinators, directors, and technical support services. There will be resistance. People will object against changes, but often this resistance is based on misconceptions and misunderstanding. Hence, try to avoid these or try to address these as much as possible and as early as possible by, for instance, organizing various talking groups, lectures, and trainings. And finally, be critical. Do not assume much, but observe, evaluate each aspect of the implementation process and be a good problem solver, that's very important, who works on an evidence base while integrating practice-based insights. So I hope our experiences with these still ongoing implementation projects are informative. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank my awesome team that makes things work. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you for giving us a lot of food for thought. Thank you for reminding us that copy-paste is never the option, that we always have to take into account our own circumstances. And thank you for highlighting that we should always be critical, because this is the point of sharing all the experience, so that we can really think about it and think what would be the best for us. I also want to thank our participants for already being very active and putting some questions into question and answer section. So, as I said, we will be answering this in the end of all three presentations, not now. So, Tasha, you have some time to check the questions that you received. And while you do that, I will give the floor to our dear colleague, Dr. Jacqueline Bosker from University of Applied Science in Utrecht, Netherlands. Jacqueline, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to give a presentation about the Dutch experiences. Well, my name is Jacqueline Bosker. I am a professor at the University of Applied Sciences in Utrecht, the Netherlands. And previously, I've been working with the Dutch Probation Service, where I was involved in the development and implementation of a risk assessment tool. I'm going to talk to you about the tool itself, so the risk and needs assessment instrument. I will explain how these instruments were implemented, how they are used in practice, and what challenges probations encountered. And I will finish with some lessons we learned. In the Netherlands, the first risk assessment tool that was used in probation was already developed and implemented in 2004. It was based on, it was called RISK, and it was based on OASIS, the instrument of the UK, and adapted to Dutch practice. Several adjustments have been made over the years, and fundamental renewal was made in 2018. The current RISK is an instrument that works with a structured professional judgment. So that means that probation officers have a pre-structured list of items, but use it to come to their own conclusion about the risks, criminogenic needs, and protective factors. And it incorporates several existing tools. Some of them are actuarial, which means that the risk of recidivism is based on an algorithm. Risk is digitally linked to the advisory report, and the report is, so it means that the report is partially filled automatically from the risk assessment tool, and then edited by probation officers. There are several theories underlying the risk assessment process and the education of probation officers to use it. An important one is the R&R model, which Kasia already mentioned, so I'm not going to talk about that. We also used some insights from development criminology, life course criminology. And as an example, I've included in the sheet Moffitt's dual pathway theory, which states there are roughly two distinguishable paths of offending. One, a small group that shows antisocial behavior at a very young age and keep on committing crimes during their life, and a much larger group that starts committing crimes during adolescence and often stop with that when they become adults. And knowledge about this kind of theories are used and in the instrument, especially for looking at the criminal behavior and decide whether this is problematic or not. Then we also use knowledge from desistance theories. In desistance theories, that's much based on in-depth interviews with offenders or prior offenders about the question, what helped you to stop offending? And this knowledge, it shows, for example, the importance of looking at the client's strengths in addition to risk, to support hope and agency in the supportive network. And this is not so much in the instrument, but it's an important component of the education of probation officers. And a fourth theoretical perspective, and that's, well, very different from the other ones, is knowledge about how people judge and decide and the pitfalls that can occur in doing so. Kahneman has written a very readable book on this. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's about heuristics and biases in decision-making. And this knowledge provides rationale for the use of structured instruments and shows why even very experienced probation officers cannot rely solely on their professional expertise. Well, the instrument itself is a compilation of different instruments. It includes a mandatory part, which consists of the OXREC. That's a short actuarial tool for an initial quick risk assessment for both general and violent recidivism. There's an inventory of the current offense and criminal history of the client, and an overview of dynamic criminogenic needs. And as you can see, these correspond to the central 8 criminogenic needs that are mentioned in the R&R model. There are also a number of additions that are deployed when relevant. So there are some additional risk assessment tools for specific offenses, the static stable acute for sex offenses, the B-Safer for domestic violence, and the VERA for violent extremism. And there are some components in risk to look at responsivity. So for example, there's the skill, which is a screener for mild intellectual impairment. And there is a place to mention other important responsivity issues, such as motivation, language problems, or physical limitations. And there is a section on victim awareness, we call it, which is both about safety of victims, but for example, also about opportunities for mediation. The risk and needs assessment is a process, and it consists of several steps. It starts with gathering relevant and important information from several sources, such as case files, other professionals, of course, interviews with the client, and if possible, also contact with the people in the context of the client, such as a partner or a family member. Based on that information, risk is completed, and that involves both scoring items and explaining their content. And then probation officers make a structured professional judgment about the risk of recidivism and risk of harm, combining both the OXREC and the criminogenic needs and additional instruments used. Criminogenic and protective factors are weighted in combination, and with that information and the information on responsivity, this provides starting points for change goals and interventions that can be deployed to achieve these goals. The result of this analysis is described in an advisory report or in a supervision plan. And I'm going a little bit fast about this one because we don't have so much time. This risk tool is used in probation practice in several phases. So in the pre-trial and pre-sentence phase, it is used to advise about conditional suspension from pre-trial detention and to advise penal decision-making in the court. And after sentencing, it is used to advise about conditional release from prison or forensic hospitals, or to make a good case management plan during supervision. The risk assessment is not used for community services. The first version of risk was implemented with the help of a multi-day training course for probation officers, the training of super users who provided on-the-job support, and support from a national team that also identified problems and questions and tried to solve them. Probation officers were involved in the development process to create support for the development and to match the working methods of probation officers as closely as possible. When the revised version of risk was implemented, again, probation officers were trained, and in that training, emphasis was more on the theoretical foundation and vision about risk and needs assessments than primarily on the use of the instrument, because they were already used to working with such an instrument. Also, managers followed the course so they can properly steer and use the use of the risk in practice. Partner organizations such as Public Prosecution Service and the Prison Service were briefed, so as a recipient of advices, they could understand how these advices are generated. And as you can see, the focus was very much on why do we do this, this kind of risk assessment, and what is the scientific background of the instrument. Probation services experienced several challenges regarding the use of the risk and needs assessment, and I'm talking about this based on my observations and experiences. So it's not that it's not based on a research or something. First is an important point is that it should not only be about risks, but also about needs. Knowledge about the risk of recidivism is, of course, relevant for decision-making. Knowledge about the criminogenic and protective factors and about responsivity are at least as important for decision-making about a good approach and support for offenders in their process of desistance. Especially in the beginning, far too much attention was paid to filling in the instrument as an obligation instead of supporting decision-making. This also sometimes led to working towards an outcome people wanted to see instead of really use the instrument to form their opinion about what the situation was. Professional expertise is essential and perhaps, I think, even more important than the instrument itself. Risk can only be helpful in the hands of well-informed professionals who use it to achieve a better analysis about a client. The tool will not do that for them. And that also means that professionals need to be open to the support of the tool. We saw at one point that experienced probation officers thought they could do without risk, but in doing so, the risk of biases may increase even among experienced professionals. Involving the client is another important point, of course, as much as possible, given the situation. At first, we used a self-assessment form for the clients, as a part of the risk assessment tool, but probation officers found it too time consuming and adding too little to the tool. So we stopped with that, but sharing goals and possibilities, and if possible, shared decision making about an advice or supervision plan is found important. The tool supports probation officers in underpinning certain choices, but they have to formulate that underpinning themselves. Probation officers sometimes find that difficult, and for that reason, training in the underlying theory is very important. The extent to which sufficient and high quality information is available may differ from case to case and from situation to situation. If there's little information and clients are reluctant to share information, it can be quite difficult to make a good assessment. Consistency in the use of the instrument is also important, and this may be difficult on specific parts of such a tool, such as psychological functioning. For example, we find that probation officers can have very different assessments about items such as impulsiveness, which is quite hard to assess in a good way. One way to deal with this is to organize regular consensus meetings, but in practice, it is sometimes very difficult to find the time for that. And we also find sometimes tension between good quality assessments and a large workload, which also may make it quite difficult to give it as much time and quality as it should. So that brings me to some lessons we have learned in Dutch practice, which I think important if probation services want to use risk assessment tools. First, I think that the purpose of risk assessment is not only aimed at risk management, but it can also support desistance. And this requires an emphasis not only on risks, but also on needs, on protective factors, and on strengths. Emphasize the use of such instruments to support decision-making. It should not be too much about the instrument, but mainly about how to use it to make better decisions and about the professional expertise that is required for that. And that is why it is important to pay a lot of attention to the underlying knowledge in training. Why are certain items included in an instrument? What do we know about it? Why is an instrument constructed in a certain way? And what knowledge is available and relevant to use if you analyze the outcomes of an instrument? This supports using it professionally instead of seeing it as a fill-in-the-blanket exercise. It doesn't stop after implementation. Good use in practice requires continuous attention. Very easily, this attention wanes and quality deteriorates. Continuous support and monitoring is therefore very important. Probation officers should also pay sufficient attention to usability of the instrument in different decision situations, both in terms of content and ICT. We have experienced in the past that improper functioning of ICT resulted in reduced support for the instrument as a whole. So ICT was the problem, but it had very much impact on how the risk assessment tool was experienced by professionals. And finally, ensure a good balance between completeness and usability. It is impossible to incorporate all the nuances that occur with clients into the instrument. If you do that, it expands into something that is very intensive, very extensive, and therefore unusable. But too little nuance and distinction can reduce support because probation officers feel that the instrument does not fit well with the client. Finding the right balance can be difficult. In the Netherlands, this is solved by making a large number of components optional and letting probation officers decide for themselves which optional components are relevant in a particular situation. And that brings me back to the importance of well-educated officers who have the knowledge to make that choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And according to the questions in our question and answers part, I see that you really did get to our participants and giving them some food for thought. So thank you very much for explaining how gradually you can go from something that we all very well know, like coming from Oasis, to something that is tailor-made for for the Netherlands. It was really good to hear. But my personal best is about you highlighting the training and how professional stuff we need to have because of course the right balance and the role of probation officer to be the one who's choosing this balance is really something very hard and really takes a good professional to be secure about our decisions. So thank you very much for highlighting this. And you can also check the questions that you received in the question and answer. While we go way to New Zealand for our last presentation, we have our dear two colleagues, Megan and Mandy, who are, I hope, awake because it's very late in New Zealand now. Please, can you tell us what's happening in the Department of Corrections in New Zealand? Megan, the floor is yours.
Good evening or good morning to you all. Greetings from New Zealand. It is currently nearly midnight, but I really welcome the opportunity to speak to you all and give a bit of a snapshot of what our practice is down here. And hopefully Anna will be sharing my slides in a minute, and then we'll be able to get started. Okay. Well, greetings everyone from New Zealand. My colleague Mandy is here as well. And to begin, in New Zealand, if we move to the next slide, we have a whakatauki or a Māori proverb, and that really guides our work as a correctional organisation. And that whakatauki is ko tahi anō te kaupapa, ko te oranga o te iwi. There is only one purpose to our work: the wellness and well-being of our people. And that whakatauki is something as a correctional organisation we've really embraced because it's not only about our staff, but the people in our care, but also our wider community that we're accountable to and responsible for. So just to briefly introduce myself and my colleague Mandy, I'm Megan Stenswick. I'm a frontline psychologist. I've been working with the Department of Corrections in New Zealand for the past 20 years in a high intensity treatment program, prison-based unit, but I'm also a trainer in the VRSSO, the Static 99, and a master trainer nearly signed off in the Stable and Acute 2007. So that's really what's brought me into the probation risk assessment space. And my colleague Mandy is also a trainer in the Stable and Acute and is in our national office as a senior practitioner advisor in the Chief Probation Officer's team. I'll just take a pause because I'm aware in New Zealand we speak very quickly. So I'll take a pause and make sure I start to slow down. So we've included our details there because hopefully this is just an opening of the door. We welcome any contact or anyone who's interested in hearing a bit more about what we're doing in New Zealand. And hopefully this is at the start of a conversation. So yes. So in New Zealand, just to give you a bit of our context, we are a national corrections service. We have nearly just under 1,500 probation officers across the country. We're managing, as you can see, nearly 30,000 individuals on a variety of community-based sentences from community work through to those who are on parole, or our extended supervision orders are our sort of post-detention community supervision for those who present a high risk of future sexual offending or very high risk of future violence. And then we also have a national prison network. The majority of our treatment is pre-release in prison. We have treatment units addressing violence, substance abuse, sexual abuse, And then we have youth units, and particularly programs focused on working with women. And I think in New Zealand, we're a fairly small country. We have a population of 5 million. But like a lot of countries who have a history of colonization, we have a significant overrepresentation of Māori and a number of the negative challenges in our community, from poverty to experiences of being a victim. And for us in the corrections environment, we have an overrepresentation of Māori at all stages of the criminal justice system. As an organisation, we don't necessarily control the courts and who comes through our doors, but we certainly have a big focus currently on making sure that our work is responsive to Māori. In our treatment environments, we are developing programs and manuals to make sure that our treatment is incorporating many of the bicultural principles. And we have kaupapa Māori practitioners working alongside our psychologists in those treatment environments to ensure that we can be as responsive to Māori as possible. But nevertheless, given that Māori make up 15% of the New Zealand population, but make up 50% of our incarcerated population, I think that that's a statistic that really is something that, as a wider correctional service, is something we're really focusing on, ensuring that the staff who work in corrections have the cultural competency to respond appropriately. In terms of the risk measures we use in probation, I'll explain what we're using and then maybe talk through our journey and some of the challenges we've encountered. But essentially, for the frontline probation officer, there is two really categories of risk assessment tools that they would be using. We do have a range that the psychologists would use. We have about 200 psychologists in the department. So when it comes to some more complex assessments, stalking assessments, interpersonal partner violence, some of those specialist assessments are likely to be referred to the psychologist. But as a frontline probation officer, in our general and violence risk space, the static risk measure we use is something called the ROC-ROI, which stands for risk of conviction, risk of imprisonment. And that was a tool that was generated in New Zealand, and it gives the probability of 5-year reconviction and the likelihood that that will be serious. So it's automatically computer generated. The probation officer just needs to understand how it's implemented and what the different guidelines are of what the score means. But it's a bit of a black box, to be honest, because it's computer scored based on the criminal history. It uses a lot of the general criminogenic indicators like age of first conviction, how long they've been in the correction system, time between offences, the nature, severity of offending. But because it's computer generated, the probation officers don't really need a lot of training in it, but they need to understand how to apply it. And it's mainly used, I guess, for triaging and prioritising in terms of treatment, and as a first sort of triage. Then for day-to-day, the probation staff are using, the previous slide, the DRAOR, which is the Dynamic Risk Assessment for Offender Reentry. And that's obviously, Ralph Sarin developed that. It's got 3 domains related to stable, acute, and protective factors, looking at 19 items, those that we know are related to reoffending, but also crime desistance. And at the end of administering the DRAOR, the probation officer formulates the most likely risk scenario and also the most serious risk scenario for that individual. And if there's any risk escalation, they're also documenting how they plan to intervene in that. In the sort of sexual offending space, we have a tool called the ASRSR, which stands for the Automated Sexual Recidivism Scale. And in essence, when the extended supervision legislation was brought into New Zealand, we had to screen the entire nation to work out who would be eligible for it. And it wasn't feasible to hand score static 99s for everybody at that time. But what we realized was that of the static 99 items, at that point, 6 of them, so not the victim item, or not the ever lived with a partner or the stranger victim or unrelated victim, but all the other items could be obtained from our computer system based on offence codes. So the ASRSR is automatically generated. It's got very similar properties to the static 99R. It's just being brought into the common risk language with very similar recidivism rates at the different risk levels. So for us in New Zealand, the benefit of the ASRSR was that it was automatic. And so for the probation officer, they need to understand how it's derived, but they don't necessarily need to actually score it. And then as sort of Kazi was talking in terms of risk needs responsivity as a foundation of what we're doing, we have the stable and acute 2007 that we're using for those who've sexually offended. So just to talk about our journey through risk assessment, I think it's been an interesting one, and that's probably what I'm going to speak about more, because what we've seen in probation risk assessment is we introduced the ROC-ROI in 1999, and that has been very embedded in our correctional system. It's an item, and the outcome would be something that any probation officer, most prison officers, any psychologist, it's pretty well understood and embedded. In 2006, we introduced the ASRS, so that was the previous version of before the age item was added, and the stable 2000 and acute 2007, and then shortly after moved to the stable and acute 2000 and the stable and acute 2007 in New Zealand. And it would be fair to say that as a person who rolled out that training back in 2006 and 2007, it was probably one of the best received trainings we've ever given to a frontline probation staff, because up until this point, they really hadn't had any tools to structure their judgment, to structure their decision making. And we would walk into those rooms and almost feel like rock stars, because the probation staff were just so keen to hear and to feel like they were being enabled to make those decisions. The DRAOR rolled out in 2010. And from there, with the renorming of the age item into the static 99R, the ASRSR was revised, and then comes us in 2022 and having to renorm practice a bit. So I'll talk about why and how we got there in the next few slides, because I think the journey that we've been on is quite a useful one to maybe understand some of the lessons that we've learned that we can maybe hopefully share with other jurisdictions. So just to give you an overview of what the risk assessment practice standards are, is that for the majority of rehabilitative sentences, the probation officer must complete a risk assessment measure at every single reporting. So typically that would be the DRAOR at each contact, or if the person has an index offence for sexual offending, then where applicable, they will have a stable completed at least annually, followed by an acute. And the maximum frequency the acute can go out to is monthly, depending on the individual. So the probation officer needs to make a decision about what risk assessment measure they're using, but there must be a risk assessment completed every reporting. It must be completed on the same day as that reported and put into IOMS, which is our integrated offender computer system. And then every 3 months, their manager needs to go through and document to check that they've checked all the risk assessments. So this risk assessment is very embedded in probation officer practice. Obviously, with some folks who are on like sort of community sentences, like community work and so forth, the DRAOR might be completed after 6 weeks, but wouldn't be completed at the same frequency as it would for somebody who was on parole or on conditions. Yeah, so that's the practice standards. And so I thought it probably was worth talking about sort of some of the lessons we've learned from the implementation of the DRAOR versus the stable and acute 2007, because it really has been a tale of two measures in our experience. So the first lesson, I guess, was really highlighted to us if we move on to the next slide, the real importance of having frontline probation officer buy-in and ownership. When we rolled out the stable and acute 2007, back in 2007, we originally had 4 trainers, 2 psychologists, 2 probation officers, but the nature of the field was that the probation officers moved on, and it was the psychologists who were left delivering the training. And over time, initially it was very well received, and then the DRAIL rolled out in 2010. When the DRAIL rolled out, there was a deliberate decision made that this was a probation officer tool, trained by probation, owned by probation. And as a psychologist, we've never been trained in it because it's very much a probation tool. But what the upshot of that is that there became a bit of DRAIL got very embedded in probation practice, but there's nothing in the DRAIL items related to harmful sexual behaviour. And so for the stable and acute, it was seen as, I've got to do something else, rather than this be part of the risk assessment toolkit, so to speak. So what we learnt that lesson there was that in the case of the stable and acute, it really wasn't, it didn't really grab over time. It lost its grab amongst probation, the probation expertise in it, the probation trainers weren't there, and it really contrasted the buy-in for the two, between the two tools. The second lesson, I guess, we learnt was that really highlighted the importance of embedding training capacity and practice supervision from the beginning. From the very beginning, when we rolled out the DRAIL, we had practice leaders, we had who were trained, we had subject matter experts, we had a lot of probation expertise in these tools over time, and that really wasn't the case for the stable and acute. The third lesson was highlighted to us was that we really probably underestimated the infrastructure and system support that you need for practice. So for example, from the beginning, the DRAIL was built into our computer system. It allowed the probation officer to demonstrate they've done the risk assessment. It was all easy for them to do. They logged into a screen, it was all there for them to record their information. It took us 10 years to get that into the computer system for the stable and acute. And so I think that really what we saw is by under investing in that system support, it actually undermined the practice over time. And the fourth lesson that we learned were, in a couple of our regions, we tried specialist teams, so teams who specialised in sexual offending, for example, and they specialised in doing those risk measures in that area. The problem was we found it actually undermined the capability of the wider workforce, because it was seen as, we don't need to know that because we're not having to do it. And in the inevitable environment where we had quite high turnover, it became in the probation space that once we lost that initial team with knowledge and enthusiasm, we really didn't have people coming through behind, and it left a bit of a void. So that's a quick summary of some of the lessons we've learned. I've just, on the next slide, sort of captured some of the articles of interest if anyone's interested, and I appreciate this is probably part of a beginning conversation, but happy to follow up with anybody on some of our experience. So I think I'm on time.
Oh yes, thank you very much. You're super on time, and thank you for speaking slow. It was great. We could really follow you. So thank you very much for taking us through a journey how you did it in New Zealand. I saw that there's a lot of tasks for a probation officer, so definitely plenty questions to come. But
a separate issue I'd say is, how do you re-norm national practice when it's gone adrift? Because that's probably a whole nother talk, but that's currently the situation that Mandy and I have been trying to do in New Zealand about re-norming practice, particularly with the stable and acute across every probation site in the country.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I will now give a floor for my dear colleague Anna. She will be our leader for question and answer sessions. So please, all our presenters, if you can stay with us a little bit more, because we have a lot of questions. So Anna, please take over.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much to the three very insightful and informative presentations. This gave actually a very important information for jurisdictions or countries that want to start implementing assessment tools, but also very interesting and important information for others that already have implemented assessment tools and want to improve. Because as we learned, working with assessment tools is a journey. So yes. From this presentation, very briefly, I would like to highlight three or four important things. And the first thing is that the three risk and need assessment tools presented are based on R&R model. The second thing I would like to highlight is that risk and needs assessment is understood as a process, as a journey. What it means is that something static, something that you do once and it's done. It's more several steps that you take, and you have to be flexible and adapt as we are working with human beings. I also would like to highlight the importance of identifying needs, not only risks. Risk is relevant, but also important for decision making to identify a protective factor or needs. Also, what I took from your presentations is that we have to translate risk assessment into management of risk. Yes, we have the risk level, but what is a good intervention plan? What do we have to do now with this risk assessment? What is a supportive intervention that is helping the client going away from crime? And the last thing, I think an important thing to highlight is that the tool helps us, but it's not enough. The probation officer knowledge as well as experience is crucial for supporting the systems. And having tried to summarize a little bit this, now I'm drawing through the Q&A questions, Q&A. We will start with the first question from Peter Rayner, and he is asking, I agree about R&R, but should we also be assessing opportunities, resources, and strengths available to the supervised person in order to inform a helpful supervision process? This question was aimed for Cassia, but all expert speakers that we have here will have the opportunity to answer. Please, Cassia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, of course, I agree with the comments. So in the presentation, I didn't have much time, so I focused on the risk assessment tools because that was already a difficult journey or complex journey. But in the R&R principles, one of the principles is also to invest in the strengths. So of course, we also include that in our risk management strategies. However, we are still struggling with the assessment issue. How to do we need to assess it separately in every case? Because we only have, in contrast to my colleagues, 10 people for all Flanders to do the assessments, and that's not their only task. So can they conduct the SAPROF, for instance, in every case? How do we combine those in the decision makings and things like that? So we still have a lot of questions regarding that, but of course we also include that in our more general assessments and in our decisions or advices regarding the risk management strategies.
Excellent, Cassia. Thank you very much for your answer. Any of the other speakers would like to say something on that question? Please, Jacqueline.
Yes. Well, I already mentioned the importance of also assessing, having attention to for protective factors and strengths. But I agree, it's the same, I think, as Kasia said, to all include it all in the instruments is really something to think about, because you don't want it to become too extensive and too large. So in the Dutch practice, we do ask about protective factors, but I think we could help probation officers better to do that in a structured way. also assess strengths is, I think, now not really supported by our tool. So that could be a good thing to do, but also one has to think about in what ways and in what way could we do it that it, well, the process doesn't become too extensive and stays workable. That's a challenge, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is a big challenge. Megan, Mandy, would you like to say something on this, or?
I was just going to comment, I think that's part of the reason when we were looking at what tool to implement in New Zealand, the DREA was chosen because of those items around protective factors. And then in the psychology space, things like the CEP Pro-VSO are part of our practice. It does feel like we're doing lots of, when you do a VRSSO and a CEP Pro-VSO and so forth. But we are trying as much as possible. And I think coming back to the responsivity aspect of R&R, that's why things like enhancing cultural practice for our staff and actually looking at what are some of the drivers of crime and what are some of the things that as a workforce we can make sure that our engagement with the individual in front of us is maximised. That's kind of where we're really focusing on workforce development.
Super, thank you very much. We have more questions. We have two questions in principle that both questions were for Jacqueline. And from anonymous attendee, we do not know the name of this person, but the questions are, what is the ideal ratio of probation officers or practitioners in order to effectively implement the programs under the instruments?
Oh, I hope I understand the question right, but what we do is we have a special part in the organization, which is a training center for probation officers. They train all probation officers, also in risk assessment. And I think it would be very good if every team, we work in teams with probation officers, and a team is about, well, 15 to 20 people. Differs a bit around the country, but I think it's very strong to have somebody in a team who can have a role as a sort of super user, or somebody who helps or mentors colleagues in doing right assessments. And we've tried to do that during implementation phases, and we now work, for example, with senior probation officers who could fill in that role. But I think that would be a good thing to do. But a ratio is, I think, a bit different to tell.
Yes, a bit difficult, of course,
Yeah.
I can imagine. This mentoring role, highlighting as a very important in the implementation, but also in the evaluation process. Okay.
Yes.
Let's go to the next question, also for Jacqueline. And the next question is, may you give more details on the algorithm application?
Oh yes, well, that's not really possible because it's about the OXREC, I think, that was developed by the University of Oxford. What they did is that they used a statistical program to form an algorithm, and this means that the different items in such an instrument are weighted differently, and in combination give an outcome that gives a clue about the risk of recidivism. But how it's built up in detail, I couldn't answer that.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go to more questions. And now we start questions for our colleagues from New Zealand. At one point, it was asked again for this anonymous participant, what is the difference between community supervision and community work?
I can answer that question. Community supervision is a kind of a lower entry or into the probation service. It's sentenced by court, and it's a time-framed sentence per se, where you would get 6 months supervision, 9 months supervision, a year's supervision, which has some kind of rehabilitative component in there, where they've identified some criminogenic needs that need to be monitored and managed with the help of probation officers. Community work is purely, I hate to say it, but it is purely a punitive sentence, and it's actually hours. So you would get sentenced to 40 hours is the minimum, and 400 hours is the maximum. And that actually makes up a large percentage of the offender population. So when you see the statistics of how many people in our care that we manage in the community, a large percentage of that will be on community work, which is just purely a punitive hours. They go out and they work in the community in various non-profit, schools, maraes, conservation, and they have to earn their hour, pay their hours back to the community, and that does make up quite a substantive amount of our statistics.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mandy, for this clarification. I think that it can be also seen in different European jurisdictions, this two variety of measures and sentences. Thank you. We have more questions also for you. May you repeat what the 4 assessments acronyms are? Also, may you give some details on the digital tools used, please? Thank you, Megan and Mandy.
I think that's why I put the articles at the back, because that might be a source for people to go to, but it was the ROC, R-O-C, risk of conviction, risk of imprisonment, the DRAOR, the dynamic risk assessment for offender reentry, the ASRSR, automated sexual recidivism scale revised, the stable 2007 and acute 2007. So that's just.
Super, thank you very much. More questions now for all of you. Christian, our participant, says, in the first 2 presentations, it was mentioned that you worked with the R&R model as a framework, but you did not mention the use of the LS R&R risk and needs assessment tool as a specific instrument. Is there a reason why you don't use the LS/R&R?
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So if you look back, because you're going to get the slides, right? If you look back at our decision tree, you can see that we included the LS CMI. They have to figure out more easier terms for all these risk assessment. But so we are using this instrument. However, we decided, based also on empirical evidence, that if you have a case of, for instance, violence, that it's better to use an instrument specifically for violent behavior. So that's why we use the L, also because we to not have it, or for not having too extensive risk assessments. We decided to use the LS-CMI only in cases where there's theft, drug offenses, stuff like that. In other cases, we immediately go to the specific risk assessment instruments. So that was also a pragmatic choice, but we use it.
Thank you for this clarification. Cassia, Jacqueline, please.
Yes, well, it's quite a long time ago that we made that decision. But if I recall, we looked at the LSIR, the version of the LS CMI, which was actually in the year 2000 or something, and to OASIS, and we thought OASIS just a little bit better matched the Dutch practice in the way it was constructed, and also had a little bit more information about the actual offending behavior and the risk of harm. And we thought that was relevant for our practice to also assess that kind of issues in order to think about risk management. So I think that was the reason why we chose OASIS, but they were a little bit similar also. So I think OASIS, the people who developed OASIS also looked very good at the LSI. So that's what we did. And then we adapted it. I think what happens is if you're starting to use these instruments, in practice, people get experienced with it and also do have opinions about it, about what they think is very useful and what they miss. So that led to a lot of, during the years, to a lot of adaptations, and we moved away from the existing instruments and now really have our own instruments, which in the basis has the same components as the LSI or as OASIS or that kind of instruments, but well, they get specified for our practice. That's what happens.
Yes, thank you again. And here we highlight again the importance of not copy-pasting, but to adapting to each local practice and cultural aspects as well. Okay. A question from Edward Bozzi. Why so many offenders in New Zealand probation service?
I think there's a combination of things. Some of it, as Mandy talked about, is a number of those folks are on sentence like community work. So they will go out with a community work supervisor with a group of them into the community. So it's not a high probation officer caseload. We have community work supervisors who aren't probation officers per se who do that work with them. The context of New Zealand is actually quite interesting, and there's a whole host of drivers, whether that be our history, some of the effects of colonisation, some of the negative statistics we've talked about, but New Zealand has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. Not good. But we also have high recidivism rates here. So despite the fact that we've got some of the world leading treatment programs, and maybe why we've started to develop some of those, really we have a correctional community where we'll have probably 55% recidivism across the board within 2 years, of which we've got about 35% being re-imprisoned within 5 years. So I don't know if it's a combination of the country size. There's 5 million people here. We're surrounded by an ocean and you can't go anywhere, so you tend to get caught if you keep doing things. We also have and I think this has affected some of our probation management at times as well, is because we do face some reputational risks. When things go wrong in New Zealand, they are front page pretty quickly. And so it's one of those things that I think that level of risk aversion can have an impact all the way through the criminal justice system, from arrest right through to sentencing and so forth. I think probably somebody a lot higher than my pay grade looks at all of these drivers. I know there's a systemic focus on trying to understand why we have such high incarceration rates. There's a whole host of things, probably part of that, yeah.
And I just want to clarify that for community work, we don't probation, there's no risk assessments that are undertaken for community work. It's just purely that punitive, come in and do your hours, and then so there isn't that kind of digging in any deeper to actually look at those criminogenic needs. So the percentage of that, certainly when you're talking about time management and probation officers being time poor, just to clarify that we don't do the risk assessments on that particular. There's 2 sentences that we don't do any risk assessments, and that's community detention and community work, because they're purely punitive.
But I'm just noticing the next question, so we'll jump in and comment on how we use risk assessment. The probation officer can use that risk assessment to make defensible decisions. So if it means they push somebody out to monthly reporting, that's the vehicle for them to be able to push them out and justify their decision making. If you're somebody who's high risk, so you're on an extended supervision order, you can actually only ever push out to fortnightly reporting. So the risk assessment does really underpin some of it gives the probation officer the language and the ability to make defensible decisions and that's kind of how it's used. So if they've got a bunch of folks on their assessment who are low risk and low DREA, we're not seeing them that much.
So someone, for example, someone on community, someone on supervision or release on conditions could be pushed out using those risk assessment tools to actually have those evidence-based decision-making, could say, right, I'm going to push this particular individual out to monthly reporting. So I will see this person once a month. So it allows probation officers, it drives their practice and focuses their allocated time, their level of intervention, and supports their decision-making.
Super. Thank you, Megan and Mandy. Now we have the two last questions from Elliot and Benedetta, and both questions are more or less asking the same. So I'm going to conglomerate in one question. Have you measured a reduction in recidivism since the implementation of the instrument in your countries, or other positive effects?
Can I say something about it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Criminal numbers have dropped quite dramatically the last years. I think that's the case in a lot of countries, but it's very difficult to say exactly what the reason is. So we hope that one of the reasons is that we professionalized as probation services, and apart from the risk assessment, also professionalized the way supervision and treatment and programs, accredited programs are implemented in the last 20 years. But we also know that there may be a lot of other reasons, such as better protection of houses, or people who stay at home and play games at the computer instead of hanging around on the streets, that kind of things. So it's quite difficult, I think, to really say introducing risk assessment and this way of working is the reason for a drop of offenses in a country. I think it's difficult to say, but I think it helps. I think we professionalized and do a better job than 20 years ago.
Please, Kasia.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I'm too fast. No, you can finish that. I have another question.
Okay. I saw you raised your hand. So, Megan, Mandy, would you like to mention something on that question, please?
In New Zealand, we look at national statistics. We probably look more actually at the interventions of our treatment programs and the outcomes of effective treatment, more so than, unfortunately, because we weren't collecting data on the stable and acute for the last 10 years we were doing it. We haven't been in a position to really look at actually analyze really what that looks like in our cohort here. And I think in New Zealand, because we're a small country, a lot of what we're seeing is a function of society's ebbs and flows. So we'll see one government come in and the prison numbers go down because there's more of a public tolerance for community sentencing and stuff like that, and then we'll have another government change and all of a sudden our prison muster will go up. So we unfortunately do see the ebbs and flows of societal's ebbs and flows as well. So yeah, I'm not sure that answers the question other than sort of commenting on the context.
Well, it gives food for thought and things to reflect, so it's also very important. Kasia, now I think that I give the floor to you.
Is that okay? Because I see there are no open questions anymore. So I wanted to, because we are at the start of our implementation, right? So I have my experts here with me and my international experts. So I would like to take the opportunity and pose two questions. First of all, our system is different in the sense that I hear that your probation officers are doing maybe only a basic level, but a level of risk assessment. We are not allowed to do that. So we have only 10 psychologists, as I mentioned. that need to perform the risk assessment. So I was really curious, what are the pros and cons of having probation officers themselves conducting the risk assessment? And the second question is, how do you deal with responsibility issues? Because we see that probation officers have a lot of questions, and I completely understand regarding responsibility. Do you assess it in a structured way, or is it pure based on observation? And how do you assist the probation officers with responsibility issues? So that's it. I'm very curious.
Yeah, I think we have gone for a train everybody approach. So every probation officer is trained in the DRAIL. Generally, you need to be a bit more experienced before you are. So the probation has different competencies, and you need to be higher up the probation competencies before you're trained in the stable and acute, because you need to have basic probation practice experience before you start managing those who've engaged in sexual offending. For us, I guess it's all we've known. That has just always been the culture, that actually this is embedded in probation, and the psychologists are then held for the higher level assessments, the complex assessments, the court work. So if there's somebody who's really complex, that's then they're referred on, or consultations sought with the psychologist. Every probation officer has a psychologist who will who's available to the probation officers in that. So the consultation, I think, is there. But in terms of, I don't think we know anything else. That's just been the culture. I mean, as you say, we've got 200 psychologists in the country of that's just corrections. So, you know, we don't have the 10 psychologists you're trying to implement this with. And I think that's one of the things we found, is that the difference between the DRAIL and the stable acute was the DRAIL from the beginning had the depth of training, depth of support, and it was national. Every probation officer, one of the things we had to do to re-norm the stable and acute, because it was so problematic, the chief probation officer instructed that every service manager in the country needed to re-attend the training within the next 6 months. So some of those sorts of things we had to kind of get practice re-normed by getting people in the trainings, understanding them, understanding the principles, understanding where things were working well and not working well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but for us, that has only ever been the way. And the reason they rolled out the DRAIL being a probation officer tool, as psychologists, we are not trained in the DRAIL, because they do not want us messing and getting in amongst it and undermining, I guess, the probation power to administer this training. Probation are the experts on this tool, not us. Mandy, I don't know if you want to add anything. As for the responsibility, Mandy's probably better to speak to that.
Not so much, but I just think that there is just reiterating what you said, Megan, is there's just been such a recent or the most recent emphasis is in New Zealand is shifting the ownership of the sexual recidivism risk assessment tools from the psych space into the probation practice space. But it's also supported by a lot of subject matter experts and trainers that are across the country. We have lots of, so we have a lot of resourcing. We've created like quite a sustainable resource model in developing trainers in those particular tools, so that more trainings can take place, more support can take place. We have a list of subject matter experts. We have Microsoft Teams, or Zoom, if you want to call it. We use Microsoft Teams in New Zealand, but we have like drop-in support clinics where anyone can come on, jump in, and actually have a clinic for an hour on a particular item in the stable or acute, and that's anyone in the country can jump on to that. So we have a lot of really a really good framework around supporting that uplift in practice. That is, so just to try to kind of put that into context.
Yeah, excellent. I think that this is crucial.
Yeah.
We learned the hard way: if you don't do it, practice drift happens. So that for us has been one of the key lessons we've learned, that actually adherence to quality practice and embedding the practice supervision is key.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for this interesting conversation as well. And now we came to the end, and I'm giving the floor to CEP Secretary General Jana Sparrow.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you to all our presenters. Thank you to participants who asked these questions. And as you can see, there are so many things we want to talk about when we are on this topic. So I'm absolutely sure that we will also have a webinar on this topic next year in the CEP agenda. So please check the web pages for the exact date, because there are more examples coming. But before we leave, I just want to ask our dear participants to be so good and just to fulfill a survey to give us a feedback on this webinar. It's really important, because this is what makes us being better and better every year in delivering you information. So Anna, is there something else they should know about the survey, or is this enough? You will send it an email?
Yes.
Okay, good. Anna will send you an email, so please just open it. It will take only a few minutes of your time, and it will mean a lot to us and to our presenters. So once again, thank you, everyone. I hope to see some of you in our next events. So please stay tuned on the CEP webpage for everything that's happening. The next thing that is happening face-to-face for CEP that is very important is our second edition of the workshop on gender-based violence in probation. And I'm also happy to say that also we will have our dear Professor Kasia with us on the workshop in Barcelona. So if you liked her today, I'm absolutely sure that you would love her in Barcelona. So if this is not a good invitation, I don't know what is. For every other event, please just sign up for our newsletter or check our social media and web pages. Thank you, everyone. Good night to our dear colleagues from New Zealand. Once again, thank you for staying up so late. Thank you to our professors from Belgium and Netherlands for sharing your experience. We all go with a lot of food for thoughts. Bye-bye.